The bank teller didn't laugh. She didn't slide the check back to me or lower her voice the way people do when they're about to deliver bad news. She went very still. Her fingers froze above the keyboard and the color drained from her face so fast I thought she might faint. Then she looked up at me, eyes wide, and said, "Ma'am, how did you get this check?" An hour earlier, my father had called it a joke. My brother had thrown his into the fire. I was the only one who kept mine. Veterans Day dinners in my family were always performances. Not the loud kind, not the flag-waving kind you see on television, but something quieter and sharper. The kind where respect is spoken about endlessly, yet never quite given where it's due. My father hosted this one at his house, the same colonial-style place he'd owned for 25 years, with white columns out front and a fireplace he liked to light, even when the room was already warm. He said it made the evening feel ceremonial. I knew what it really did. It made him feel important. The dining table was set with his good china. Crystal glasses caught the glow of the chandelier. A small American flag stood in the center, carefully placed between the wine bottle and a bowl of roasted vegetables. Everything was tasteful, controlled, predictable. I arrived straight from base, still stiff in my movements, the smell of cold air clinging to my coat. I hadn't changed. That alone earned me a look. "You didn't bring a dress?" my brother Mark asked, glancing up from his phone. He was already seated, jacket off, sleeves rolled just enough to show he didn't do manual labor. "It's a dinner, not a drill." "I came as I am," I said. My voice was calm. It always was. Dad smiled in that tight way he did when he wanted to appear gracious. "She's in uniform every day," he said to Mark like I wasn't there. Hard habit to break. I took my seat anyway. Years in the service teach you something early. Sit down, keep your back straight, don't fidget, observe. Dinner began with Dad's usual speech. He raised his glass and talked about sacrifice, about how proud he was of those who serve. He didn't look at me when he said it. His eyes stayed on the table, on Mark, on the reflection of himself in the glass. Mark nodded along, smiling at the right moments. He worked in investments, a word my parents used the way some people use prayer, frequently and without explanation. He talked loudly about a deal he was closing, about a client who owned property in Scottsdale. No one asked what I was working on. No one ever did. When dessert was cleared, Dad stood up again. This time he reached into his jacket pocket. "I thought we'd do something special this year," he said, in the spirit of gratitude. He laid 3 envelopes on the table, thick ones, official-looking. Mark let out a low whistle. "What's this?" Dad smiled. "A little something for each of you. $20,000. For a moment, the room went very quiet. I felt my shoulders tense, a reflex I hadn't fully shaken, even after years of training. Money had always done that to me in this house. It wasn't just currency here, it was a message. Dad handed them out one by one. When the envelope reached me, it felt heavier than it should have. I didn't open it right away, neither did Mark. Dad laughed, a casual sound, dismissive, before either of us could say anything. "Relax," he said. "It's just a prop from an account that's been closed for years." Mark barked a laugh. "You had me for a second. I wanted to see your faces," Dad said, clearly pleased with himself. "You should have seen yours." Mark opened his envelope, glanced at the check, and snorted. "Real funny." Then, without hesitation, he crumpled it in his fist and tossed it straight into the fireplace. The paper caught immediately. The edges curled, blackened, and disappeared into flame. "Good one, Dad," Mark said. "Almost thought you were serious." I looked down at my own envelope. The check inside was crisp, the number written clearly. $20,000. My name spelled correctly for once. Dad watched me. "Well, you're not going to frame it, are you?" Mark smirked. "Careful. She might take it to the bank." Dad laughed again. "Let her. They'll laugh her right back out." Something in me went still, not angry, not hurt, just alert. I thought of early mornings on base, of standing in formation while someone else talked about duty, of learning over and over that the smartest move wasn't always the loudest one. I folded the check neatly and slid it back into the envelope, Then I put it into my coat pocket. The room went quiet again. Mark raised an eyebrow. You serious? Dad's smile faltered just slightly. Come on, don't be dramatic. I'm not, I said. My voice didn't shake. I just don't like wasting paper. Dad waved a hand. Suit yourself, but don't get your hopes up. I nodded once. I wasn't hoping. I was counting. After dinner, Mark cornered me near the doorway. You know it's fake, right? He said. Don't embarrass yourself. I won't, I said. He laughed softly. You always were like this, too serious, always thinking there's something more going on. Maybe there was, maybe there wasn't. But as I stepped out into the cold night, the envelope pressed against my side. I realized something important. Everyone else had already decided what that check was worth. I hadn't. I didn't go straight home after dinner. I drove aimlessly for a while, letting the quiet settle in around me. Veterans Day had always been complicated for me. On base, it meant ceremonies, speeches, a sense of shared understanding. At my father's table, it felt like a costume party I hadn't agreed to attend. When I finally parked outside my apartment, the building was dark except for one light on the third floor. I sat in my car longer than necessary, engine off, hands resting on the steering wheel. The envelope was still in my coat pocket. I could feel its edges every time I shifted. Inside, my apartment was small and orderly. Everything had a place. Boots lined up by the door, keys on the hook. The discipline wasn't something I turned on and off. It followed me home. I hung my coat carefully and took the envelope out. I didn't open it yet. Instead, I set it on the kitchen table and made myself a cup of coffee. Even though it was late, I needed the ritual more than the caffeine. As the kettle boiled, memories crept in the way they always did when I was tired. My father's voice years ago telling me the military was a phase. My brother's laugh when I shipped out. Have fun playing soldier, he'd said. They never said they were ashamed of me. They didn't have to. It lived in the pauses, the subject changes, the way my accomplishments were filed under interesting but irrelevant. I sat down across from the envelope and finally slid the check out. It looked real, too real for a joke. My name, the amount, my father's signature at the bottom, neat and practiced. The paper was heavy, not the flimsy kind used for novelty checks. Still, I didn't let myself react. Hope is dangerous when you've been trained not to expect much. I slept poorly. Dreams came in fragments. Firelight, Mark's hand tossing the check into the flames, my father smiling. Waking up felt like surfacing from cold water. By morning, my decision was already made. I put on civilian clothes, but moved the way I always did, efficient, precise. Before leaving, I slipped the envelope into my bag. No ceremony, just another item to carry. The bank was a local branch I'd passed 100 times, but never needed to enter. It smelled faintly of carpet cleaner and old paper. A bell chimed when I walked in. 2 tellers were open. A couple sat in the waiting chairs whispering to each other. I stood in line, eyes forward, shoulders squared. This wasn't fear, it was readiness. When it was my turn, I stepped up to the counter and slid the check across without a word. The teller was a woman in her 40s, hair pulled back, glasses perched low on her nose. Her name tag read Linda. She smiled politely. How can I help you? I need to verify this, I said. She took the check, glanced at it, and began typing. Her fingers moved quickly at first, confident. I watched her face instead of the screen. Years of briefings had taught me that expressions tell you more than words. Her smile faded. She typed again, slower this time. She leaned closer to the monitor. The air felt heavier, like the moment before a command is given. Is there a problem? I asked, keeping my tone neutral. She didn't answer right away. Instead, she looked up at me, really looked, as if seeing me for the first time. Then she looked back down at the screen. Ma'am, she said quietly, can you tell me how you received this check? The word ma'am landed differently than it usually did, not respectful, cautious. My father gave it to me, I said. She swallowed. Please, give me just a moment. She stood up and walked away, check in hand. I stayed where I was. No shifting, no sighing, just waiting. A man in a suit emerged from an office near the back. He took the check from Linda and studied it. Then he looked at the screen. His jaw tightened. They whispered to each other, not panicked, but urgent. When they returned, Linda's face had lost what little color it had left. "The account linked to this check," she said carefully, "is active." I felt something cold settle in my chest. "There must be a mistake," I said. "I was told it was closed." She shook her head. "It's not. Funds are available immediately." For a moment, the sounds of the bank faded, the hum of the lights, the soft shuffle of feet. All I could hear was my father's laugh from the night before. "Just a prop." "Would you like to deposit it?" she asked. I nodded once. As she processed the transaction, she didn't meet my eyes. When she handed me the receipt, her hands were shaking slightly. I took the slip of paper and looked down. $20,000 available balance. It wasn't the number that hit me. It was the certainty. I thanked her and walked out without rushing. Outside, the morning air felt sharper than before. I stood on the sidewalk, receipt in hand, and let the truth settle. My father hadn't been joking. Mark hadn't been laughing at nothing. They hadn't expected me to check. I sat in my car and stared at the receipt for a long time. This wasn't relief. It wasn't excitement. It was clarity. For the first time, I understood the rules of the game I'd been playing my whole life. And I realized something else, too. Silence hadn't protected me before. But now it was going to protect them from knowing what I knew. I didn't tell anyone about the deposit. Not my unit, not my friends, not even the one person on base who knew more about my family than the rest. Information is weight, and I needed to know how much I was carrying before I decided where to put it down. I drove straight back to my apartment and laid the receipt next to the check on the table. Side by side, they told a story my father had never intended me to read. The check was still crisp, uncreased, the way it had looked when he slid it across the table with that half smile. The receipt, on the other hand, was thin and temporary, already curling at the edges. Proof rarely looks important. That's how it survives. I sat there for a long time, listening to the quiet. In the military, silence is never empty. It's filled with possibilities, with contingencies, with the understanding that something is about to happen, even if you don't yet know what. My phone buzzed just after noon. A text from my father. "Did you make it home okay last night?" I stared at the screen. The timing was too precise to be casual. He wasn't checking on my safety. He was checking on the envelope. I typed back, "Yes." The reply came almost instantly. "Good. Don't forget dinner next Sunday. Your mother's making that casserole you like." I almost laughed almost. Instead, I set the phone face down on the table. Familiarity was one of his tools. He used it to soften edges, to make questions feel rude. I spent the afternoon doing what I always did when something didn't make sense. I gathered facts. I pulled old emails, bank statements I'd been copied on years ago and never really looked at because I'd been told they were handled. I logged into the financial portal my father had set up for me back when I was still in ROTC. Back when I'd believed him when he said it was safer if he managed things. The password still worked. That should have been my first warning years ago. In my world, passwords changed regularly. You assumed breach, not loyalty. The dashboard loaded slowly, then populated with numbers that made my stomach tighten. Accounts I recognized, balances I didn't. There were transfers marked temporary notes about reallocations, comments that assumed I wouldn't be reading closely. I wasn't supposed to notice. That evening, I went for a run. The cold air burned my lungs, grounded me in my body. Every step pounded out a rhythm I knew well. Think, breathe, don't rush. When I got back, there was another message. This time from Mark. "Dad says you took the joke kind of seriously." I waited a full hour before responding. "I just deposited the check." 3 dots appeared, disappeared, reappeared. "You what?" I didn't answer. A few minutes later, my phone rang. I let it ring out, then again, then a voicemail. "Hey," Mark said, his voice lighter than it should have been. "Look, if the bank made a mistake, you should probably not touch the money. You know how these things work. Dad will handle it." I deleted the message. That night, I barely slept. Not because I was anxious, but because my mind kept moving, lining things up, testing theories. Patterns emerged the way they always do when you stop accepting explanations and start looking for structure. The next morning, I went back to the bank. This time, I asked for a manager. Her name was Susan. She had the kind of calm authority that comes from decades of saying no for a living. We sat in her office, the door closed, the check and receipt laid out neatly between us. "I need to understand something," I said. "Was there ever any attempt to close this account?" She reviewed the records carefully. "No," she said. "There were inquiries, discussions, but no closure." "And the funds?" I asked. "Were they ever restricted?" She shook her head. "Not in any way that would prevent access." I nodded. "Thank you." As I stood to leave, she hesitated. "Ma'am," she said, lowering her voice, "you should know this account has a history." I paused. "What kind of history?" She chose her words carefully. "It's been used selectively, large withdrawals for specific purposes, always authorized by the same person." "My father," I said. She didn't confirm it. She didn't have to. Driving away, the picture sharpened. This wasn't a one-time lie. It was a system, a long-standing arrangement, built on the assumption that I wouldn't challenge it. That assumption was their first mistake. The confrontation came sooner than I expected. That evening, my father showed up at my apartment unannounced. I saw his car from the window and felt a familiar tightening in my chest, not fear, anticipation. I opened the door before he knocked. He stepped inside, looking around with polite disapproval. "You didn't say you moved the couch." "I didn't think it mattered," I said. He cleared his throat. "The bank called me today." I waited. "They said you deposited a check that wasn't meant to be cashed." "It cleared," I said. He frowned. "That's not the point." "It is," I replied. For a moment, his mask slipped. "You should have come to me first." "I did," I said, "for years." Silence stretched between us, heavy, uncomfortable. "That money isn't for spending," he said finally. "It's being managed." "By you," I said. "For you," he corrected. I reached into my bag and set the receipt on the table and explained this. He didn't pick it up. He didn't have to. He already knew. "You don't understand how these things work," he said, his voice tightening. "Mark has obligations, investments. He needs flexibility." "And I don't?" I asked. He sighed, as if tired by my stubbornness. "You chose the military. You have stability." There it was, the justification I'd heard my entire life. I looked at him, really looked at him, and saw not a father, but a man who had made a calculation and didn't like being shown his math. "I'm not giving the money back," I said, his jaw clenched. "We'll discuss this as a family." "No," I said quietly. "We won't." He stared at me for a long moment, then turned and walked out without another word. I closed the door behind him and leaned against it, heart steady. They knew now that I knew, and that changed everything. Once you see the pattern, you can't unsee it. That's the thing about truth. It doesn't announce itself with fireworks. It settles in quietly, rearranging the furniture in your mind until nothing fits the way it used to. After my father left, I didn't collapse or cry. I cleaned my kitchen. I wiped the counter where the receipt had been. I washed the mug he hadn't touched. Order helps me think. It always has. I opened my laptop and began where I should have years ago, not with anger, not with accusations, but with records. The account my father had managed for me dated back to when I was 19. I remembered the conversation clearly. I was home on leave, still sunburned from field training, still believing that adults told the truth by default. He'd sat me down at the dining table, the same one where Mark later tossed his check into the fire, and explained that money was complicated, that markets were volatile, that my temperament, creative and disciplined as it was in other areas, wasn't suited for financial decision-making. He'd said it gently, the way people do when they think kindness makes a lie harmless. "I'll oversee it," he'd said, "just until you're settled." I had nodded. I trusted him. Now I followed the trail he never expected me to trace. Transfers labeled temporary that never reversed, withdrawals timed around Mark's ventures and LLC formation here, a down payment there, notes written in shorthand that assumed familiarity. Confidence leaves fingerprints. I cross-referenced dates with emails, with calendar entries, with my own deployments. There were gaps, months when I was unreachable, when my access was restricted for security. During those gaps, the account moved, not wildly, carefully, like someone who knew exactly how much could be taken without being noticed. The realization didn't land all at once. It came in pieces, each one heavier than the last. This wasn't mismanagement. It wasn't confusion. It was intent. My phone buzzed again. Mark, this time calling. I let it ring. He left another message. "Look," he said, irritation bleeding through the casual tone. "Dad's upset. You don't want to turn this into something it's not." That phrase did a lot of work in our family. It smoothed over raised voices, unexplained purchases, sudden changes in plan. It was the verbal equivalent of sweeping dirt under a rug. I went for another run, harder this time. My muscles burned, grounding me in the present. By the time I got back, I'd made a decision. If they wanted this to be a family discussion, it would be just not on their terms. I called my father the next morning, asked him to meet me for coffee, neutral ground, public. He agreed too quickly. He arrived early, already seated, hands folded around a cup he hadn't touched. He looked tired, older than I remembered. For a moment, the urge to protect him flared. Then I remembered the ledger. "I've been reviewing the account," I said after we sat down. His eyes flicked up. "I told you." "I know what you told me," I interrupted, not raising my voice. "I'm asking you to explain the withdrawals." He sighed, leaned back. "You're looking at raw data without context." "Then give me context," I said. He didn't. Instead, he talked around it, about responsibility, about Mark's potential, about how the money would all even out in the end. I listened. When he finished, I nodded once. "Okay," I said. "Then let's formalize it." His brow furrowed. "Formalize what?" "The management," I said. "Let's involve a third party, an audit for transparency." The word audit changed the air between us. He masked it quickly, but not quickly enough. "That's unnecessary," he said. "It would complicate things." "I don't mind complicated," I replied. "I mind unclear." He stared at me, searching for something. Doubt, maybe compliance. He didn't find it. "We'll talk about it," he said finally. "We are talking about it," I said, "now." He left shortly after, citing a meeting. As he walked away, I felt the last thread of illusion snap. He wasn't angry because I'd misunderstood him. He was angry because I'd understood him perfectly. That afternoon, I called the bank again, asked for copies of everything I was entitled to receive. The woman on the line hesitated, then complied. Policies are shields until someone reads them closely. The documents arrived in a secure folder. I spread them out on my table, aligning edges, dates, amounts. A story emerged, clear and damning. The money hadn't vanished. It had been redirected strategically, repeatedly. Mark called again that evening, his voice tight. "Dad says you're making this a legal thing." "I'm making it a factual thing," I said. "You don't want to do this," he warned. "It'll hurt people." I almost laughed. It already did. There was a pause. Then his tone shifted softer. "We're family." I closed my eyes, counted a slow 4, then answered. Family doesn't require silence. When the call ended, I sat alone in the quiet. Outside, the sun dipped low, casting long shadows across the floor. I thought about the nights I'd spent away from home, trusting that what I'd left behind was safe. I thought about the way my father spoke of honor at dinner, about sacrifice. Truth has weight. It presses down on everything until something gives. In this case, it wasn't going to be me. I didn't confront them with what I'd found, not yet. In my line of work, you don't rush the objective once you've located it. You stabilize the environment. You let the situation reveal itself. People who believe they're in control are remarkably generous with information. I requested a meeting, not a confrontation, not an argument, a meeting. I sent the message to my father and Mark in the same thread, neutral language, professional tone. We should sit down with a financial advisor and go over the accounts together for clarity. I want us all aligned. The reply came quickly. "Dad, that seems reasonable. Mark." "Fine, let's get this settled." They chose the advisor. Of course they did. A man my father had known for years, someone who'd attended the same charity dinners, the same holiday parties. Familiar faces breed confidence. Confidence breeds mistakes. The office was downtown, all glass and polished wood. Diplomas lined the walls, awards framed in brushed metal. Everything about the place said, "Trust us." We sat around a small conference table, my father at the head, Mark to his right. I took the seat closest to the window. Light matters. You want to see faces clearly. The advisor began with pleasantries, then pulled up the account summaries on a large screen. Charts appeared, numbers climbed neatly from left to right. "As you can see," my father said, gesturing, "the funds have been preserved responsibly." I nodded. I asked no questions. Mark leaned back in his chair, arms crossed. "This is what we've been saying," he added. "Everything's fine." I waited. The advisor clicked through statements. He spoke in the language of percentages and projections. He didn't mention the transfers, not yet. They were buried in appendices, footnotes no one expected me to read. When he finished, my father turned to me, satisfied. "Almost," I said. I reached into my bag and set my folder on the table. It was thin, unassuming. That was intentional. "I'd like to review the transaction history," I said, "specifically the periods when I was deployed." The advisor hesitated, just a flicker. Then he clicked. Lines of data filled the screen. Dates, amounts, notes. I leaned forward slightly. "This transfer," I said, pointing. "What was it for?" My father answered without looking at the screen. "A temporary reallocation." "And this one?" I asked. 2 weeks later?" "Same," he said. Mark nodded. "Short-term strategic." I let them talk. Let them layer explanation over explanation. Words piled up. None of them quite fit. "Okay," I said finally. "Then let's do an audit." The room went still. "That's not necessary," the advisor said quickly. "It is to me," I replied. "I want an independent review, full access, clean verification." My father smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "You don't trust us." I met his gaze. "I trust documentation." Mark scoffed. "You're blowing this out of proportion." "Then an audit will prove that," I said. Silence stretched. The advisor shifted in his seat. "We can arrange something limited," my father offered, "just to put your mind at ease." "No," I said. "Comprehensive." There it was, the line they didn't want to cross. I watched the calculation happen behind my father's eyes, the same one I'd seen on briefing room screens before decisions were made. "Fine," he said at last, "if that's what it takes." We set a date, a week out. Time enough for them to prepare. Time enough for them to panic. I didn't tell them that I'd already begun. That night, I accessed the cloud storage my father used for family documents. He'd asked me to set it up years ago, trusted me with the technical side, never changed the passwords. People confuse convenience with security all the time. Files began appearing as soon as I logged in. Not immediately, then slowly, then all at once. Draft statements, scanned forms, spreadsheets with new names and old numbers. I watched them populate in real time, timestamps blinking like signals on a radar. They were building something. I downloaded everything. Saved copies, logged metadata, creation dates, author tags, software identifiers. Every detail told a story, and I knew how to read stories built from systems. By midnight, a final file appeared, clean, polished, labeled final_statement.pdf. I opened it. To an untrained eye, it looked flawless. Bank logos, proper formatting, correct balances, the kind of document people accept because it looks like what they expect. But I've spent my career around checklists, standards, deviations. You learn to spot what doesn't belong. I zoomed in, then further. The font was wrong, not dramatically, just enough. The kerning on the numbers was off, alignment inconsistent by a few pixels. The balance line floated where it shouldn't. I checked the metadata. Created 3 days ago. Application, Adobe Photoshop. Author, my father's laptop. I closed the file and leaned back in my chair, heart steady. This wasn't rage-inducing. It was almost disappointing. For people who thought so highly of themselves, the work was sloppy. They weren't planning to defend the truth. They were planning to manufacture it. The day of the audit arrived, cold and gray. The advisor's office felt different now, tense, expectant. A new person joined us this time, the auditor, neutral, unimpressed, clipboard in hand. My father spoke first, confident, prepared. He slid the printed statements across the table. "These are the complete records," he said. The auditor nodded, began reviewing. I waited. Minutes passed, pages turned. Then the auditor stopped. "This document," he said slowly. "Where did it originate?" My father answered too quickly. "From the bank." The auditor looked up. "It doesn't appear to be." Mark shifted. "What are you implying?" "I'm implying," the auditor said, "that this file shows signs of manual alteration." My father laughed. "That's ridiculous." "Is it?" I asked. I stood and connected my laptop to the screen. The room felt smaller as the image expanded. I didn't accuse. I demonstrated. I showed the fonts, the misalignments, the metadata. Each detail landed like a measured step forward. No shouting, no theatrics, just facts. When I finished, the room was silent. The auditor cleared his throat. "This constitutes misrepresentation." My father opened his mouth, closed it. Mark stared at the screen, color draining from his face. I sat back down. "I asked for clarity," I said. "Now we have it." The trap hadn't been elaborate. It hadn't needed to be. I'd simply given them space to show me exactly who they were. No one raised their voice after that. There was no shouting, no slammed fists, no dramatic exit. The collapse didn't come like a storm. It came like a pressure change, quiet, unmistakable, impossible to ignore once it started. The auditor excused himself to make a call. The advisor sat very still, hands folded, eyes fixed on the table, as if the polished wood might offer him guidance. My father stared at the screen where his work had been laid bare. The neat fiction he'd built pixel by pixel now reduced to what it was, a lie dressed in professionalism. Mark broke first. "This is getting blown out of proportion," he said too quickly. "It's just formatting, a technicality." The auditor returned, clipboard under his arm. "It's not a technicality," he said calmly. "It's falsification." My father finally spoke. His voice was low, controlled, the way it had always been when he wanted to sound reasonable. "We were protecting her." The auditor looked at me. "Is that accurate?" I met his eyes. "No." There it was, a single word, clean and final. I didn't elaborate. I didn't need to. The documentation did the speaking. Now, the advisor cleared his throat. "Given the circumstances," he said, "we need to pause all activity on the account until this is resolved." My father's head snapped up. "You can't do that." "I can," the advisor replied, suddenly less friendly. "And I am." Mark leaned forward, palms on the table. "This money is tied up in commitments." "Then those commitments will have to wait," the auditor said. "An investigation will determine next steps." The word investigation hung in the air, heavy, inescapable. My father looked at me then, really looked, not as his daughter, not as the child he'd guided and corrected and redirected, but as an obstacle he hadn't planned for. "You didn't have to do this," he said. I kept my voice even. "I didn't do this. You did." The meeting ended without ceremony. No handshakes, no smiles, just quiet instructions and the soft click of a door closing behind us. Outside, the city moved on as if nothing had happened. Cars passed, people laughed. The world doesn't stop for private reckonings. My phone buzzed as I reached my car. A message from Mark. "We need to talk." I didn't reply. By the end of the week, the consequences had settled into place. Accounts frozen, access revoked, requests denied. Systems do what they're designed to do once you force them to look. My father called twice, left messages that swung between anger and pleading. He spoke of family, of misunderstanding, of how this would look to people who mattered. I listened once, then I stopped. There's a moment in every long operation when you realize the objective has shifted. It's no longer about exposing the problem. It's about deciding what you do with the truth once you have it. For me, the answer was simple. I returned to base. The routine welcomed me back. Early mornings, briefings, the steady rhythm of work that doesn't care about your last name or your inheritance. My rank meant something here. My performance meant more. One afternoon, as I was logging out for the day, my phone buzzed again. An unfamiliar number. "I need you to know," the voice said when I answered, "that this is going to be difficult for all of us." It was my father. "I imagine it is," I said. "You've humiliated us," he continued. I leaned back in my chair, looking out at the flag fluttering in the distance. "No," I said quietly. I declined to be humiliated anymore. There was silence on the other end, then a sharp exhale. "You think this makes you strong?" he said, walking away. "I don't think about it in those terms," I replied. "I think about it in terms of accuracy." He didn't understand that. He never had. When the call ended, I felt something loosen inside me. Not triumph, not relief. Something closer to alignment. The fallout continued without me. Lawyers talked, accountants recalculated, stories were told and retold in rooms I wasn't in. My absence became its own statement. Mark sent one last message. "You didn't have to burn it all down." I stared at the words, then typed back. "I didn't burn anything. I just stopped pretending the fire wasn't there." That night, I lay in my bunk and stared at the ceiling, listening to the distant sounds of the base settling into sleep. I thought about the check in the fireplace, how quickly paper turns to ash when someone decides it's worthless. The truth is harder to burn. It lingers. It reshapes the space it occupies. And once it's exposed, there's no quiet way to put it back where it was. The following Veterans Day came quietly. No dinner, no speeches at my father's table, no envelopes. The calendar still marked the date in red, but the house where it used to be performed had gone silent. Silence, I'd learned, isn't always absence. Sometimes it's evidence. I spent the morning on base. There was a short ceremony by the flagpole, nothing extravagant, just a few words spoken plainly, a wreath laid with care. The wind was sharp, the kind that carries memory. I stood with my unit, hands clasped behind my back, and felt the familiar steadiness settle into my bones. Here, respect wasn't a costume. It was a practice. Afterward, I walked alone for a while, letting the day breathe. My phone stayed in my pocket. I'd stopped checking it the way I used to. When you remove yourself from a system, the system keeps trying to pull you back in. It takes time for it to accept the loss. The investigation had concluded months earlier. The findings were clinical, precise, funds misdirected, documents altered, authority exceeded. Consequences followed accordingly, some financial, some reputational. None of them were mine to carry. I didn't attend the final meeting. My presence wasn't required. In truth, it never had been. That realization arrived late, but it arrived fully formed. On my desk at home, the receipt from the bank was gone. I'd thrown it away once it served its purpose. Proof doesn't need to be kept forever. It just needs to be recognized. I thought about my father sometimes.